Singapore, a tiny island nation of 6 million people, one of the most food-secure countries on Earth. Yet it imports 90% of what it eats from over 170 countries around the world. On paper, this makes perfect sense. Diversify your sources, stockpile essentials, hedge against global shocks. And for decades it worked. But in 2019, the government announced a bold, almost audacious, goal to produce 30% of Singapore's nutritional needs locally by 2030. They called it 3 by 30, a vision to grow food inside warehouses, on rooftops, in vertical farms, turning concrete into farmland, technology into harvest. 6 years later, the plan is dead, cancelled, replaced by smaller, more modest targets. How did one of the world's most efficient governments, the country that mastered water scarcity and urban planning, fail at feeding itself? And why did a nation built on ambition stumble over lettuce, eggs, and fish? This is the story of Singapore's failed local agricultural aspirations, the right goal, at the wrong time. Section 2, Beginnings. When Singapore was a farming island. Before Singapore became the skyscraper city we know today, it was a farming island, and not in a small way. In 1965, the year Singapore became independent, this tiny nation of 1.6 million people was producing most of its own food. In fact, more than 60% of everything Singaporeans ate came directly from local farms. If you had visited Singapore back then, you wouldn't find Marina Bay. You'd find mangroves, vegetable plots, and thousands of chickens. Back then, nearly 22.5% of the entire island, a quarter of Singapore, was agricultural land. Over 20,000 small family-run farms covered the island, and these weren't hobby plots. Singapore produced 100% of its pork, poultry and eggs, and about a quarter of its vegetables. For a place with almost no natural resources, this level of self-sufficiency was extraordinary. But here's the twist nobody talks about. Singapore didn't lose its farms because it failed. It lost them because it succeeded too fast. As the economy took off in the late 60s and early 70s, the government began an aggressive, almost superhuman expansion phase. Singapore was building homes, factories, ports, airports, everything a new country needed. But all of that required one thing Singapore never had enough of: land. By the 1970s, Singapore was converting about 520 hectares of land every year to support industrialization and housing. That's the equivalent of clearing more than 900 football fields annually. Urban growth wasn't just a plan. Singapore treated it like a survival mission. Agriculture simply couldn't compete. And then came the signal that changed everything. In 1971, the Ring Concept Plan, Singapore's foundational land use blueprint, quietly made it clear that agriculture had no long-term future on the island. The message was unmistakable: the farms that built early. Section 3, the collapse when development crushed agriculture. By the early 1980s, Singapore's agricultural story wasn't just shrinking, it was collapsing at a speed almost no country had experienced. And to understand why, you have to look at how Singapore thinks about survival. For most countries, farming is cultural. But for Singapore, land is strategy. Every square meter has to justify its existence. And in the 70s and 80s, farming couldn't compete with the value of industry. Ports, airports, and the housing Singapore urgently needed. As the economy expanded, the government began to view agriculture not as a foundation, but as a luxury. Development wasn't gradual, it was explosive. In a decade, Singapore transformed from a post-colonial port town to an export-driven industrial powerhouse. High-value manufacturing zones expanded. Public housing projects multiplied. Zhongji Airport opened in 1981. Jurong Industrial Estate kept growing. Each of these projects demanded land large, contiguous plots agriculture couldn't provide. The question wasn't, should we save the farms? The question was, what should we sacrifice to survive? Then the market hit. Singapore's farming economy was outcompeted by imports: cheaper chicken from Malaysia, vegetables from Thailand, and pork from Indonesia. Local farmers couldn't scale fast enough, innovate fast enough, or cut costs fast enough to match neighbors with abundant land and cheaper labor. Even when the government offered incentives to intensify production, the economics didn't add up. When your neighbor can grow something cheaper on 100 times more land, You lose. The workforce was shifting too. Young Singaporeans in the 80s wanted office jobs, stable salaries, and air conditioning. Farming required long hours, manual labor, and rising land rents. The old generation was aging out. The new generation wasn't coming in. Singapore had entered a phase where farming was no longer an aspiration. It was a relic, and the land losses accelerated. Between 1980 and 1990, more farms were cleared than in the previous 2 decades combined. Pig farming was phased out almost entirely by 1990. After decades of pollution concerns, poultry farms were consolidated, vegetable farms folded under rising costs. Agriculture's footprint shrank so dramatically that by 1993, only a tiny cluster of farms remained in places like Lim Chu Kang and Neo Tu, pockets of green in a sea of development. The message was clear. Singapore was no longer a farming island. It was a global city, and the nation decided consciously, strategically, that feeding itself locally was less important than building an economy powerful enough to buy anything it needed from the world. But this decision came with a cost. As the last farms disappeared, Singapore entered a new dependency: imports. And in a world of climate shocks, supply chain risks, and geopolitical tension, relying on others suddenly looked far more dangerous than expected. Section 4. The dependency problem. When imports became risky. When Singapore shifted from farms to imports, it felt like a smart, almost elegant solution. Why grow food when you can buy it cheaper, fresher, and in massive quantities from around the world? For a rising global city, outsourcing agriculture wasn't a weakness, it was efficiency. And for a while, it worked beautifully. Singapore tapped into 170-plus supply sources, built one of the world's most diversified food portfolios, and became a master at turning economic strength into food security. If one supplier had issues, another could easily fill the gap. Money wasn't just power, it was stability. But over time, something changed. Global volatility began to rise, and Singapore discovered the hard truth about depending on the world. You control your money, but you don't control other people's crises. The first warning signs came from Asia. The avian flu outbreaks in the early 2000s shattered poultry supplies. Across the region, vegetable safety scandals in China made a nation famous for quality control suddenly question what was entering its ports. Then came the 2007 airweight global food crisis, when exporting countries started doing something no one expected. They stopped exporting. Nations that Singapore relied on, Thailand, Vietnam, India, imposed sudden food export bans to protect their own populations. For the first time in modern history, Singapore had money. But money didn't matter. There simply wasn't food to buy. And that's when the deeper fear surfaced. A hyper-connected global city is strong until the world disconnects. Singapore realized it wasn't dealing with a supply issue. It was dealing with a control issue. No matter how rich, efficient, or diversified you are, if the world pulls back, you're exposed. And the wake-up call was simple. Imports can feed you, but they can also trap you. This realization would push Singapore toward one of the most ambitious food strategies on Earth, rebuilding what it once abandoned.